But we're glad that you're here this morning. I'm excited about where we're headed this morning. It's a section of scripture that it's one of those we get bogged down in because there's a bunch of laws and rules and we're like, why is this important to us? And I think it's so important as we look at this to ask ourselves, what is God saying in the midst of this? What is God trying to remind us in this? Remember, the first section of Exodus leading up through the Exodus was about what God was doing. But now we receive the Ten Commandments and we're beginning to ask the Israelites, what is their response to God going to be? And so the question for us is, what is our response going to be as we move forward? How is God speaking to us? What is God asking us to do during this time? So we're going to pick up Exodus chapter 20, verse 22. It's a law concerning the altar. One of the important things I think we learn about in Exodus is what it means to worship. And I think that's so important as we find ourselves worshiping in a way we've never worshiped before. We're worshiping in our homes, on our couches, in front of our iPhones, or wherever we are. We're worshiping in a different way. But at the core of worship is this fear and this reverence towards God and our undivided attention towards Him. And so we begin to see that God desires that in verse 22. So chapter 20, verse 22 of Exodus. The Lord said to Moses, "Thus you shall say to the Israelites, you have seen for yourself that I spoke with you from heaven. You shall not make gods of silver alongside me, nor shall you make for yourselves gods of gold. You need make for me only an altar of earth, and sacrifice on it your burnt offerings and your offerings of well-being, your sheep and your oxen, in every place where I cause my name to be remembered. I will come to you and bless you. But if you make for me an altar of stone, do not build it of hewn stones, for if you use a chisel upon it, you profane it. You shall not go up by steps to my altar, so that your nakedness may not be exposed on it." So as we hear that first section of Exodus, we see a couple of things there. It talks about the stones being chiseled. And so God was saying, look, I don't require anything elaborate. There was a belief in this day that anything that was constructed in this way by a chiseled stone was considered unholy then. And so God was saying, just use what you have. Use what's available to you. And that's where we are today. We're using what we have. We're using technology to worship. We're using our homes to worship. We're using our families, and we're connecting in different ways. And so it's not about the place where we are. It's about our hearts. And then he talks about you shall not go up the steps or that your nakedness may be exposed. It was not uncommon in this day for worship to other gods to be performed by priests who were naked, and so God's like, don't defile this worship in that way. Make it different. Make it stand out. That I operate and I have a different set of values in that. And so we ask ourselves, what is worship? Now, I love what John Wesley says. John Wesley writes about this section. He says, "Ever since Adam fled upon hearing God's voice in the garden, sinful man could not bear either to speak to God or hear from Him immediately. We must not fear with amazement, like being startled into flight from God, but we must always have in our minds a reverence of God's majesty, a dread of His displeasure, and an obedient regard to His sovereign authority." We must always have in our minds a reverence of God's majesty. And we can do that anywhere we are. This morning, as Jennifer and I and Cole were walking, there was the majesty of God in the sunrise that we saw this morning. We can find those moments anywhere. And yes, it helps us when we gather as the people as we've known, but we're finding new ways. And I think this season is about us asking ourselves, what is our faith life really about? What is it that we're trying to accomplish during this season? What is God trying to teach us about our worship? We show up on Sunday mornings so often pre-March, and it was just something we did. And now we're having to really be intentional and think about what we're doing, because it's easy for us to just not turn on the live stream. It's easy for us not just to sleep a little later or enjoy the morning with a cup of coffee a little longer. We're having to be really intentional. And so this section is reminding the Israelites in the wilderness that they need to be intentional about worship, that they need to make sacrifice, but God's going to provide for that sacrifice. He says that give offering in the fatty portions of the flesh, and you consume the meaty portions. He's providing for the people in the midst of the worship. And so how is it that we worship each and every day? And then we shift gears in chapter 21 here in Exodus, and it does something different. We begin to see that we have some laws regarding to our lives with one another. And we think, well, this seems counter to who God is and what we know about. But what it shows us is God's redemptive work. It reminds us that God's message has not changed. Christ was all about redemption of our lives. And here in this section, what we see is God's desire for people to experience redemption. And so chapter 21, let's take a look at that. These are the ordinances that you shall set before them. When you buy a male Hebrew slave, he shall serve 6 years, but in the 7th he shall go out a free person without debt. If he comes in single, he shall go out single. If he comes in married, then his wife shall go out with him. If his master gives him a wife, and she bears him sons or daughters, the wife and her children shall be her master's, and she shall go out alone. But if the slave declares, I love my master, my wife, and my children, I will not go out a free person, then his master shall bring him before God. He shall be brought to the door or the doorpost, and his master shall pierce his ear with an awl, and he shall serve him for life. When a man sells his daughter as a slave, she shall not go out as a male slaves do. If she does not please her master, who designated her for himself, then he shall let her be redeemed. He shall have no right to sell her to a foreign people, since he has dealt unfairly with her. If he designates her for his son, he shall deal with her as a daughter. If he takes another wife to himself, he shall not diminish the food, clothing, or marital rights of the first wife. And if he does not do these 3 things for her, she shall go without debt, without payments of money. So I want to talk just for a minute about this idea of slavery here in this season. It's not the slavery we think about from an Americanized standpoint. Slavery in this perspective, this Hebrew slave that's talked about in verse 2, it's a debt slavery. It's for failure to pay your debts, and so you would enter a period of indentured servitude, if you will, to help pay off that debt. And so it's a different form of debt. And then when it talks about the women, again, possibly a father didn't have the money to create a dowry for his daughter, and so he would sell his daughter to slavery so that she might have a better life, the possibility for a better life. But what we see here is that God is about redemption within his people, that it's about the treatment of other people, that we treat one another fairly and justly in this season. And so I think that's so important for us to remember, because we're challenged with how we treat people each and every day. How do we respond to them? How do we interact with them? Do we have a respect for them? Because they are God's children in God's sight. And so we need to remember that. So God gives us this law concerning the slaves. In verse 12, concerning violence, we know in the 10 Commandments there's laws against violence, but God wants to deal justly with that. And so verse 12, whoever strikes a person mortally shall be put to death. If it was not premeditated, but came about by an act of God, then I'll appoint for you a place to which the killer may flee. But if someone willfully attacks and kills another by treachery, you shall take the killer from the altar for execution. Whoever strikes father or mother shall be put to death. Whoever kidnaps a person, whether that person has been sold or is still held in possession, shall be put to death. And so we hear about this idea that, look, sometimes accidents happen, right? That's the idea of manslaughter. It's unintentional. And so there's exceptions for that. It talks about treating how we treat our parents, and not just as children, but this is talking about the treatment of older parents by adult children, really. And how do we interact with that? Because the sense of generational community was so important for the Israelites, living maybe 3 or 4 generations together. And so it was important to respect those that were our elders. And that idea of kidnapping, that is just wrong, that you cannot take someone unwillfully. And we see that so often today in the world of sex trafficking and those kind of things. And that's why the church has to take a stand in those types of things and stand forward and say that's wrong. That's unjust. And we seek justice in the world. Verse 17, whoever curses father or mother shall be put to death. When individuals quarrel and one strikes the other with a stone, or first that the injured party, though not dead, is confined to bed, but recovers, walks around outside with the help of a staff, then the assailant shall be free of liability, except to pay for loss of time and to arrange for full recovery. When the slave owner strikes a male or female slave with a rod, and the slave dies immediately, the owner shall be punished. But if the slave survives a day or 2, there is no punishment, for the slave is the owner's property. When people are fighting, injure a pregnant woman, so that there is miscarriage, yet no further harm follows, the one responsible shall be fined what the woman's husband demands, paying as much as the judge determines. If any harm follows, then you shall give life for life, eye for eye, tooth for tooth, hand for hand, foot for foot, burn for burn, wound for wound, stripe for stripe. When a slave owner strikes the eye of a male or female slave, destroying it, the owner shall let the slave go, a free person, to compensate for the eye. If the owner knocks out a tooth of a male or female slave, the slave shall be let go, a free person, to compensate for the tooth. There's this idea that, yes, there are consequences for our actions. So slaves have to be set free. There's judgment for our sin, right? God has expectations for us. We will stand in the judgment of God in our death and ask for forgiveness in those moments. And God is showing that there are consequences, but there's also opportunities for redemption. And He's also showing the need for grace during this time, right? That you offer grace. You offer people to continue their lives and not just immediately put them to death. Even if someone's been severely harmed or hurt in some way. And I think that's just so important. This section, what it does when it talks about the injury or a miscarriage, it places such a high value on life. And I think that's so important for us, because today, one of the things we're having to determine is, what value do we place on life? What value do we place on our lives and the lives of others, people we don't even know, in our actions, in how we interact with the world on a daily basis? And so this text, the text of Exodus, reminds us that in the midst of a wilderness experience, the uncertainty, God says life matters. And it matters, and it needs to be protected. And so we're doing the same thing. And so we try to make good choices. We are respectful. I wear a mask when I go to HEB, or we minimize trips out and those types of things. We're respectful of those things. And I think that's so important for us to remember today. It reminds us of who we are, that we're to do no harm, right? I mean, it's one of Wesley's general rules, to do no harm. And so that's a core of who we are to be as Christ followers in our world today. Let's continue in verse 28. When an ox gores a man or a woman to death, the ox shall be stoned, and its flesh shall not be eaten, but the owner of the ox shall not be liable. If the ox has been accustomed to gore in the past, and its owner has been warned but not restrained it, and it kills a man or woman, the ox shall be stoned, and its owner shall be put to death. If a ransom is imposed on the owner, then the owner shall pay whatever is imposed for the redemption of the victim's life. If it gores a boy or a girl, the owner shall be dealt with according to this same rule. If the ox gores a male or female slave, the owner shall pay to the slave owner 30 shekels of silver, and the ox shall be stoned. If someone leaves a pit open or digs a pit and does not cover it, and an ox or a donkey falls into it, the owner of the pit shall make restitution, giving money to its owner, but keeping the dead animal. If someone's ox hurts the ox of another, so that it dies, then they shall sell the live ox and divide the price of it, and the dead animal they shall also divide. But if it was known that the ox was accustomed to gore in the past, and its owner has not restrained it, the owner shall restore ox for ox, but keep the dead animal. And so this speaks of care of God's creation, what God has blessed us with. God has blessed us with animals for food, animals to help in our labor. And so God is saying in this section that it's the law concerning this property and the ox, that we have to be respectful of that, and the animals have to be used properly, and they have to be treated properly. And so that's why it says that if it was to be accustomed to killing someone, that the animal should be put down and it should not be consumed, because it would be considered unclean. And so that care of creation, of the blessings that God has given us. Chapter 22, laws of restitution. When someone steals an ox or a sheep and slaughters it or sells it, the thief shall pay 5 oxen for an ox and 4 sheep for a sheep. The thief shall make restitution, but if unable to do so, shall be sold for the theft. When the animal, whether ox or donkey or sheep, is found alive in the thief's possession, the thief shall pay double. So here we hear that, we heard about the slavery, and that slavery was about debt. And so here we see that individuals are sold because of their debt. But in the midst of that slavery, there's opportunity for redemption. And that comes in the 7th year when slaves are set free. It follows a lot of the law of the time. It's not completely contrary to that. But it offers more grace than the law of the time. In verse 2, yes. If a thief is found breaking in and is beaten to death, no blood guilt is incurred, but if it happens after sunrise, blood guilt is incurred. When someone causes a field or a vineyard to be grazed over, or lets livestock loose to graze in someone else's field, restitution shall be made from the best in the owner's field or vineyard. When fire breaks out and catches in thorns, so that the stack grain or the standing grain or the field is consumed, the one who started the fire shall make full restitution. When someone delivers to a neighbor money or goods for safekeeping, and they are stolen from the neighbor's house, then the thief, if caught, shall pay double. If the thief is not caught, the owner of the house shall be brought before God to determine whether or not the owner had laid hands on the neighbor's goods. In any case of disputed ownership involving ox, donkey, sheep, clothing, or any other loss, of which the party says, "This is mine," the case of both parties shall come before God. The one whom God condemns shall pay double to the other. When someone delivers to another a donkey, ox, sheep, or another animal for safekeeping, and it dies or is injured or is carried off without anyone seeing it, an oath before the Lord shall decide between the two of them that the one has laid hands on the property or the other, the owner shall accept the oath, and no restitution shall be made. But if it was stolen, restitution shall be made to its owner. If it was mangled by beast, let it be brought as evidence. Restitution shall not be made for mangled remains. When someone borrows an animal from another, and is injured or dies, the owner is not being present, full restitution shall be made. If the owner was present, there shall be no restitution. If it was hired, only the hiring fee is due. And so again, we get this idea of what it means to interact with other people in significant ways. Get to my notes here. My next note, I apologize. That we have to recognize that and see that we have to take responsibility for what we're doing. And I think that's so important. God calls the Israelites, and he calls us as Christ followers to take precaution, to protect others from risk of safety or life, and to hold accountable those who are negligent. And so that's what this text is speaking about, is that responsibility that we must take, that we have a responsibility to, not to just ourselves. In this world of self, we have a responsibility to our neighbors and our friends. And I really think that that's one of the lessons that's being taught here during this season, that we're learning how connected we really are. Even though we're in this season of disconnect, what we see is that our actions do play a role in the lives of others and around us. And so what this says is that in the judgment of others, when we interact with others, we have to take those things seriously, and we have to evaluate those things seriously. Just as a jury in a trial doesn't take lightly their responsibility to work out whatever judgment's going to be found. God is reminding us that there needs to be a set prescription for these things. And I know back earlier in the winter, in January, I was part of a jury here in our community, and we had to decide what the appropriate judgment, what the appropriate punishment was for this individual that we just found guilty. It was a gut-wrenching decision because we didn't have specific guidelines to go by. But we worked in that room of the 12 of us to try to find some grace while also holding accountable for the actions that were committed. And the idea of consequences in all of this, but also for the redemption side. And so let's go ahead and finish up chapter 22 here. Verse 16. When a man seduces a virgin who is not engaged to be married and lies with her, he shall give the bride price for her and make her his wife. But if the father refuses to give her to him, he shall pay an amount equal to the bride price for virgins. You shall not permit a female sorcerer to live. Whoever lies with an animal should be put to death. Whoever sacrifices to any god other than the Lord alone shall be devoted to destruction. Now, this is one of those verses that gets a lot of attention today in our world when we look at those issues related to the LGBTQ community. But I think the most important thing is that there's a value of human life, there's a respect of human life here, and there's a respect of boundaries, and we need to remember those things. We need to remember that there's appropriate relationships that God calls us to, and that's marriage. That's commitment to another person, and so we have to be mindful of that. Verse 21: You shall not wrong or oppress a resident alien, for you were aliens in the land of Egypt. You shall not abuse any widow or orphan. If you abuse them when you cry out to me, I will surely heed their cry. My wrath will burn, and I will kill you with the sword, and your wives shall be widows, and your children orphans. And so, again, we're talking about the relationship with people. In the Ten Commandments, it was focused on our relationship with God and our relationship with one another, that vertical and that horizontal relationship. And so here again, what we see is that need to have a good vertical or horizontal relationship, and that horizontal relationship is going to affect our vertical relationship with God as well. Verse 25, if you lend money to my people, to the poor among you, you shall not deal with them as creditors. You shall not extract interest from them. If you take your neighbor's cloak and pawn, you shall restore it before the sun goes down. For it may be your neighbor's only clothing to use as cover. And what else shall that person sleep? And if your neighbor cries out to me, I will listen, for I am compassionate. And so that reminder, that's where this idea of mission comes from, right? That we aren't to, I love that old term, we talk about that all with our kids, is the Indian giver, and you try to take something back, and, but what we're seeing here is that, we just need to act in compassion, not as an effort to try to gain something out of it for ourselves. Try to profit from that. Yes, we conduct business. Our church has a loan for the building, but this is that interaction. So we wouldn't go to a homeless person and say, "Well, I'll feed you if you give me your bike." We wouldn't do that. We need to feed them, right? We need to provide for those needs. And I really think that's what God is speaking to here. God is speaking to that, meeting those needs and helping others have the things they need to have. Verse 28, you shall not revile God or curse a leader of your people. You shall not delay to make offering from fullness of your harvest and from your outflow of your presses. The firstborn of your son shall give to me. You shall do the same with your oxen and with your sheep. 7 days it shall remain with its mother. On the 8th day you shall give it to me. You shall be people consecrated to me. Therefore you shall not eat any meat that is mangled by beast in the field, and you shall not throw it to the dogs. So what are we offering God? Are we offering God our best? Are we offering God compassion to others? Are we offering God the first of our fruits? Are we offering the leftover, the mangled? And I think that we have to, that's such a struggle for us, because our natural tendency is to keep the things that are best, to keep the things that have the most value for ourselves. And in this section, God's reminding the Israelites in the midst of wilderness, in the midst of having nothing really, I still need you to offer me your best. I need you to put me first in your life. I have to be your first priority. And so this section that we looked at today, we think about worship. We think about our relationship with other people. We're reminded of God's redemptive work, which is really the message of Christ, right? The redemption that we each experience that comes through Christ. God's willingness to offer us grace in the midst of our mistakes and our regrets. We see the high value God places on life, and the high value He places on our right relationship with Him. I hope you have a blessed day. We'll pick back up on Thursday in chapter 23. I enjoy this time. I look forward to Tuesdays and Thursdays with you each week. I miss being with you in person. Wednesday Bible study was always one of the highlights of my week, but I'm glad we're able to do this. If you have questions today, put those on the Facebook comments, on the YouTube comments. Let us know those things. Shoot me an email, and we'll try to address those. I loved our dialogue that we had in this time together, and so we can continue that in different ways. And so I encourage you to do that. This is a challenging section. It's one of those sections that if you're reading through the Bible, you kind of get to and you go, why do I need to know all of this? But it has such a powerful meaning to us. And it does continue to show God's message of love and grace that we see in the New Testament. Have a blessed day. Let me pray for you. Holy God, we give you thanks for the beauty of this day. We give you thanks for the community we're a part of. We give you thanks for the reminder that our lives are interconnected and that we must respect one another's lives and be supportive of that. We give you thanks for the reminder of what it means to worship and put you first in our life. God, help us do that. Help us do that in every aspect of our life, each and every day, not just on an hour on Sunday morning. God, help us worship wherever we are. Help us see how you, the marvel of your creation and your work in your hand. God, just hear our prayers this morning. God, we know that there are those in our community that are hurting, that are broken today. God, we just ask that you would be with them. God, you would lay your hand on them. God, that you would allow them to know that they're not alone, that they're a part of your family, and that you've promised to walk with them, and you've promised you've commanded to not fear, but to trust. And so, God, we come in fear of reverence to you this morning, asking for your help in those things. God, continue to help us make good decisions. Continue to help us know how best to respond to this crisis that we're a part of. God, thank you so much for loving us. Thank you so much for the church and the power of the church in our world today. We pray all these things in Christ's holy name. Amen. One last reminder before we leave, we have some new Connect groups that are forming and launching. Those start actually tonight. And so if for some reason you haven't had a chance to sign up for one of those, you can go to our website and do that. I sent an email yesterday with a link that you can sign up. You can shoot me an email. Give me a call. I'll be happy to connect with you. We're going to be doing those by Zoom, and I'm really looking forward to that. And so I hope you'll be a part of those if you have not signed up. It's something different. It's not Bible study. It's about covenant relationship with one another. It's about being in community. I think it's one of the best ways we have to grow in our faith is to walk along others that are on the same spiritual journey as us. And so as Jesus would say, come and see what he has to offer. And so look forward to being a part of those. God bless, and we'll see you tomorrow night at Wednesday Night Live at 6:30 on Facebook, on YouTube, and our church website. Peace.